Story 1. Working at a cemetery is strange in itself. It's like being in two worlds at once. One full of life where the workers handle maintenance and operations, and one silent, heavy with all the people buried there. The place I worked wasn't some small churchyard either. It was massive. Hundreds of acres of land, most of it still undeveloped, stretching further than the eye could follow. If you stood in the middle, you felt swallowed by the quiet. That evening I had clocked out early. Instead of heading straight home, I decided to cut across the grounds and stop by the mausoleum near the front. It was a huge building, probably the most striking part of the whole cemetery. Families who could afford it had their loved ones entombed there, and workers like me had the codes and keys to get inside. Most days, hardly anyone was there, unless there was a service. That's part of why I liked going. It felt like being in a pocket of silence. Inside, the air always carried this faint cold, not freezing, but enough to give you a chill if you lingered. There were 3 floors open to the public, but I knew there were more levels hidden away. The elevator had a special switch that only certain staff could use, and the stairwells to the higher floors were locked. Sometimes I wondered what was really up there, though I never had a reason to find out. That night I wasn't alone at first. Some co-workers who handled upkeep of the building were around, but they left after a while to handle outdoor work. I stayed behind. I didn't mind being by myself in there. In fact, I preferred it. With everyone gone, the place got even quieter. My footsteps echoed in a way that made the halls sound bigger than they were. I wandered down to the lower level. That's when I noticed the boiler room door standing wide open. Normally, it was kept shut tight. I figured one of my coworkers must have gone in and forgotten to close it, so I just pulled it shut and brushed it off. Nothing unusual. At least that's what I told myself. I started roaming the halls again, reading the names on the crypts like I always did. I don't know why. I guess I liked reminding myself these were real people, not just stone slabs. The longer I stayed down there, the heavier the air seemed to get. It was like someone had lowered the oxygen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really alone. Then came the footsteps. They echoed faintly from the stairwell. I froze, expecting someone to appear at any moment, maybe another worker or even a family member. But no one came out. The sound stopped just before it should have reached the hall. I stood there waiting, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe it was the old pipes. Maybe someone had come down but turned back. But I couldn't find a single person. I even walked through the hallways, checking corners, expecting to bump into someone who'd laugh and ask why I looked so spooked. There was no one. Trying to shake it off, I went back upstairs. On the main floor, there was an organ they sometimes used during funeral services. I sat there and pressed a few keys, the sound bouncing off the walls. For a moment, it almost felt normal again. When I finally decided to head out, I thought I'd take one more look around. I drifted back downstairs, and that's when my stomach dropped. The boiler room door was open again. I knew for a fact I had shut it earlier. This time I hesitated. My brain tried to line up excuses. Maybe the latch was loose. Maybe the air pressure had pushed it open. Still, my gut told me something wasn't right. I leaned in and glanced inside. The room was empty, completely still. Nothing moved, but I swear the second I looked, I felt a rush of cold air, like someone had just brushed past me. That was enough. My body went into fight or flight, and I chose flight. I bolted upstairs, taking the steps 2 at a time, and pushed through the main doors without looking back. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't slow down until I was back near the operations area at the far end of the cemetery. Later that night, I mentioned it to one of the managers. He gave me this look like he wasn't surprised at all. He told me that plenty of strange things had happened in that mausoleum over the years. Footsteps when no one was there, lights flickering in the middle of the night, doors opening on their own. He said I wasn't the first to run out of there shaken. The part that still eats at me is the door. I can accept footsteps being pipes or echoes. I can accept cold drafts in an old building. But that door had been shut. I know it. And the fact it was standing wide open again when no one else was down there. That's the piece I can't explain away. Was it something paranormal? I don't know, maybe. Or maybe it was just some fluke, and my mind filled in the blanks because I was already creeped out. But if you asked me whether I'd go down into that lower level alone again, My answer would be simple: not a chance. Story 2. They say cemeteries are supposed to be quiet, like a library for the dead. But I learned pretty quick that silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it feels like the air itself is holding its breath, waiting for you to notice the things you're not supposed to. I spent about half a year working as a gravedigger, and even though it wasn't my first job, it was the one that left the biggest impression on me. People think it's only the dead you're around, but really it's the shadows, the noises, and that constant feeling that you're intruding on something that doesn't belong to you. One afternoon, we got assigned a burial in the older section of the cemetery. The place was filled with tilting headstones, some so worn down you couldn't even read the names anymore. A lot of them had those mossy streaks running down like old tears. Normally, we'd bring in a backhoe and get the hole dug in a couple of hours. But because the plot was tucked between older graves, they didn't want heavy machinery on that part of the ground. We had to do it the hard way, by hand. The digging itself was rough, harder than usual. The dirt in that area had settled in strange ways, packed tight with roots and rocks. Every time the shovel hit the ground, it felt like striking a wall. The sun was hot, but the deeper we got, the cooler it felt, almost like the earth below was holding a draft of its own. My partner and I kept trading shifts because the work wore us down fast. I remember noticing how quiet it was around us. Normally, you'd at least hear birds or traffic in the distance, but it felt like everything had shut off once we started. After a few hours, shadows stretched across the ground, and the only light left was this dim orange glow bleeding through the trees. That part of the cemetery didn't have working lights, so once the sun dipped, it got dark fast. My partner climbed out to grab tools from the truck, leaving me inside the hole. That's when I started noticing small things. The first thing was the smell. It wasn't strong, but it was sharp, like damp earth mixed with something metallic, almost like blood. I tried telling myself it was just the soil, maybe some old iron or rusted pipe buried underneath, but it clung to my nose in a way that didn't feel natural. Then came the sound, faint but steady, like someone dragging a fingertip slowly across brick. I froze, my shovel hanging in the air. The noise was right against the wall of the grave. I told myself it was just the dirt shifting. I pressed my ear closer, thinking maybe it was a small animal tunneling through. But when I stopped moving, the sound stopped too. That unsettled me more than anything because it felt like whatever it was, it knew I was listening. My partner came back, and I didn't say anything. We kept digging until the light was nearly gone. By then, we were maybe 5.5 feet down. I swung my shovel into the side and felt it scrape something solid. I thought it was a stone, but when I pried at it, a piece of old brick came loose. My heart jumped into my throat because we weren't supposed to be touching anything from neighboring plots. Still, curiosity got the better of me, and I leaned in to see. Behind the loosened brick, there was this small pocket of space. It shouldn't have been there. The older graves didn't use cement casks, just brick vaults stacked tight. I expected to see more bricks behind it. Instead, there was just blackness, like a hollow cavity. I told myself it was just a gap in the structure, but then something shifted inside. At first, I thought it was a trick of the eyes. Darkness can make you imagine movement. But this wasn't my eyes. It was real. A faint shuffle, like fabric dragging against something, came from that gap. I dropped my shovel without meaning to, and it clanged against the dirt wall. My partner asked if I was okay, but I brushed it off, saying I hit a root. I got out of that grave for a few minutes just to calm down. When I climbed back in to finish, the air felt heavier, almost damp, like the inside of a basement. I shoveled slower, every strike of the blade making me tense up, waiting for another sound. Nothing else happened after that, but I couldn't stop glancing at that gap in the brick. The whole time, it felt like something on the other side was aware of me, waiting for me to get closer again. By the time we finished, it was pitch black, and I couldn't see anything more than a foot in front of me. My partner joked that the dead were probably laughing at how long it took us, but I couldn't even force a smile. I've thought about it a lot since then. Maybe it was a rat, or maybe the ground shifted when I knocked the brick loose. But deep down, I can't shake that image of something moving in there. The sound wasn't random, and the way it stopped whenever I stopped listening still bothers me. Cemeteries are strange places. You expect them to be empty, but sometimes they remind you that not everything buried stays quiet. Story 3. Some places have a way of swallowing the daylight before the sky does. The cemetery I worked in always felt like that. It didn't matter if the sun was still hanging on. It always seemed darker in there, like the shadows had been waiting all day just to stretch themselves out. One evening in late October, I found myself staying longer than usual after a burial service, finishing up the last part of the job that everyone forgets about, filling the grave back in. Most people only see the part with flowers and words. They don't stick around for the dirt and the silence. It was supposed to be simple. Just the loader tractor, some dirt, and a few hours of work before I could head home. But almost as soon as the sun dropped behind the trees, I noticed something wasn't right. The air carried that sharp bite of autumn, and even though there wasn't any wind, the branches above me rattled like dry bones. I tried not to think about it, because cemeteries at night are already creepy enough without your imagination running wild. Still, I remember telling myself it was just another shift. I'd done it before. When I turned on the tractor, the first red flag appeared. The lights didn't work. I thought it was odd, but not a big deal. Machines mess up all the time, and I figured I'd just push through in the dark. But as I started scooping dirt, something about the silence began pressing in. Usually you can hear traffic from the highway, or at least the hum of bugs. That night there was nothing. Just the sound of my own shovel scraping against stone when I had to climb off the tractor and fix small details. It was like everything outside the cemetery had gone quiet, like the place had cut itself off from the rest of the world. After a while, I noticed the shadows in the far corner of the graveyard looked thicker than they should have been. I brushed it off as the headlights being out, but it almost looked like the trees themselves were leaning closer. Every so often I'd catch movement, something pale slipping between the headstones. But when I stopped to check, there was never anything there. I told myself it was just my eyes adjusting to the dark. Still, it left my chest tight every time I glanced up. I kept working, trying not to look around, but the odd noises started creeping in. I swore I heard faint whispers, the kind you hear in a crowded room where you can't make out words. Only there was no one there. At first I thought maybe it was the wind carrying sound from somewhere far away. But when I stopped the tractor's engine and really listened, the whispers were still there, low and steady, circling the graves. My skin prickled all over. I told myself I was overtired. Then came the cold spots. One moment I'd be sweating from shoveling dirt. The next I'd step into a patch of freezing air so sharp it felt like stepping into a freezer. It didn't make sense. It was a calm night, no breeze, and yet these cold spots kept moving. At one point I swore I felt something brush against the back of my neck, icy and light, like fingertips. I spun around fast enough to trip over the edge of a grave marker, but of course nothing was there. I worked as fast as I could, feeling like eyes were on me the entire time. Once, out of the corner of my vision, I thought I saw someone standing just behind the row of cedars, watching. When I blinked, they were gone. But the unease only got heavier. Every rustle, every creak of the earth settling made me jump. By the time I was done, my nerves were shot. I climbed down and decided to check the tractor lights one last time before leaving. I flipped the switch again, hoping maybe I'd done something wrong earlier. Nothing. Darkness swallowed everything in front of me, except for the dim glow from the sky. I cursed under my breath, too exhausted to care anymore, and locked the shed up before heading home. Here's the part that stuck with me. The next day, when I told the boss about the lights not working, we both went over to check. The tractor fired up, and the lights turned on perfectly. No problem. They stayed fine the entire time I worked there. No loose wires, no blown fuses, nothing. Just that one night when I was left in total darkness, surrounded by whispers and shadows that shouldn't have been there. I've never been sure what happened. Part of me thinks maybe I was just spooked, that my brain filled in gaps because I was tired and alone in a cemetery at night. But another part of me, the one that can still feel those icy fingers on the back of my neck, thinks maybe it wasn't just my imagination. Story 4. When you spend a summer working in a cemetery, you start to notice how quiet the world feels when most of the living avoid the place. The grounds don't hum like other public spaces. There's no traffic, no background chatter, just the buzz of insects and the sound of your own boots brushing against the gravel. I took that job during college because it paid better than anything else I could find, and for the most part, it wasn't bad. Mowing grass, trimming hedges, pulling weeds, routine work. But some mornings had a heaviness about them, like the air itself was pressing down harder than usual, as if something invisible was hanging over the graves. I was used to odd things already. Tools would go missing, only to be found placed neatly on headstones I hadn't gone near. I often caught strange smells, like burnt hair or decaying meat, drifting across the grounds even though there was nothing around that could explain it. At first I thought it was just my imagination working overtime in a place where death was literally beneath my feet. You tell yourself the brain plays tricks when you're alone among rows of stone markers. That's easier than considering other explanations. One morning the weirdness escalated. The sun had barely risen, and I was pushing the mower along the back section where the older graves stood. That area always creeped me out more than the rest. The stones were cracked, moss had eaten away the names, and the trees overhead blocked out most of the light. The grass was thick and uneven, and the mower choked a couple of times as if it didn't want to move forward. That was when I noticed the smell again. Stronger this time. Bitter and acrid, like burnt plastic mixed with something rotting. At first I thought maybe someone had dumped garbage, or maybe a dead raccoon was decomposing in the grass. I followed the smell toward one of the shaded corners near the stone wall. The closer I got, the more my stomach turned. That was when I saw it. The body of a cat. Its legs were tied together with some kind of cord, and the entire body was scorched black, as if someone had set it on fire right there on the cemetery grounds. The grass around it was charred in a perfect circle, but there were no signs of matches, no lighter, no evidence of anything else that could have caused the fire. It looked fresh. Too fresh. The ground was still warm when I crouched to look. I remember thinking someone must have done this in the middle of the night, which didn't make sense. The gates to the cemetery were locked, and it wasn't the kind of place people snuck into easily. I reported it to my supervisor, who just shrugged and said vandals sometimes did sick stuff like that. He told me to clean it up and get back to mowing, but I couldn't shake the feeling something else was wrong. That day, every time I turned the mower back on, it would sputter and die. When I used the weed trimmer, the line snapped again and again, far more than usual. Tools I had set down would be gone when I reached for them, only to appear later in spots I hadn't been. And the entire time, I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows flitting between the graves, shapes darting just behind the trees. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Later, as I dumped the grass clippings near the maintenance shed, I heard the faintest sound of hissing. At first I thought it was the wind pushing through the tall weeds, but then it grew louder, almost like a whisper, stretched out and sharp, circling me. My skin crawled, and the hair on my arms stood on end. It felt like I wasn't alone anymore, like something had followed me back from that charred spot in the grass. That night I couldn't sleep. The smell of burnt fur lingered in my nose even though I had showered twice. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of the cemetery. The exact spot where I had found the cat kept replaying in my head. Except in the dream, the cat wasn't there. Instead, I saw a figure kneeling in the grass. It had no face, just a dark, hollow void where its head should have been. It kept making that same hissing sound, like it was trying to speak but couldn't form words. I woke up drenched in sweat, convinced for a moment that I could still hear it inside my room. I tried to rationalize everything. Kids sneaking in, animals causing the noises, the dream just being a side effect of being freaked out. But the next day at work, when I went to mow the same section, the charred circle of grass was gone. Not just grown over, gone. Perfectly smooth, like the fire had never touched it. The earth was undisturbed, greener than the rest of the patch around it. I told myself maybe the groundskeeper had cleaned it up more thoroughly than I thought. Maybe I was overthinking. But deep down, I know what I saw, and I can't explain why the ground looked like nothing had ever happened. I only stayed at that job until the end of summer, and even now, years later, I don't like talking about it. Whenever people bring up cemeteries or ghosts, my stomach knots up, and I remember that smell, that hissing, that figure in my dream. Maybe it was all just in my head. Maybe someone really did burn that poor animal, and I let the creepiness of the place get to me. But the truth is, I don't fully believe my own excuses. There are some things you see that never leave you, no matter how much you try to explain them away. That summer in the cemetery is one of mine. Story 5. Graveyards have a strange kind of silence. Not the quiet you find in the woods, or the calm you get late at night when everyone's asleep, but a heavier quiet, like the air itself is pressing down on you. I didn't think much of it when I started working at one in Florida, mostly just saw it as another job. Mowing the grass, trimming trees, keeping the grounds neat. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid. Still, after a couple of months, I started to feel like the place carried more than just the dead. One afternoon, the crew had been digging a grave. They wrapped up earlier than usual and left the excavator sitting there. The thing was parked on a patch of dirt, bucket half down like a giant animal pausing mid-bite. I didn't think anything of it when I went on my lunch break. I usually sat close to where they worked because it was shady, and that day I parked myself near the machine. I was halfway through my sandwich when I heard it. A sound like someone smacking metal with a hammer. Sharp, repeated. Not the occasional clank you'd expect from a machine cooling down. This was steady, deliberate. At first I thought maybe one of the crew stuck around, working on it or tightening something, but the banging kept going, loud and consistent, like someone was making a point with each hit. After 5 minutes, I started to get uncomfortable. By 7, my curiosity got the better of me. I tossed my food back in the bag, stood up, and walked over. As soon as I got within a few feet of the excavator, the banging stopped. Dead silence. I circled the thing, expecting to find a coworker crouched on the far side, maybe with a wrench or tool. Nothing. The dirt was undisturbed, no footprints, no sign anyone had been standing there. I stood there for a while, waiting for it to start up again, but the machine was as quiet as the rest of the cemetery. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the hydraulics releasing pressure, maybe something loose inside that shifted just right. Machines make noise, especially the old ones. But the way it cut off the moment I got close, it didn't feel mechanical. It felt aware. That wasn't the only time the place got under my skin. I live just down the street from that graveyard, so I pass by it constantly. Nights are the worst. You'd think after working there, I'd be numb to it, but I still get uneasy driving past. Once, late at night, I caught sight of someone wandering between the rows of stones. It was a woman, moving slowly, her shape pale against the darker background. I slowed down, trying to figure out if it was just someone paying respects late, or maybe even a homeless person cutting through. But the thing is, the graveyard is fenced in. The only open gate at that hour was locked, and she wasn't walking toward an exit. She just drifted along, head bent, her figure vanishing and reappearing between the monuments. I sat there longer than I should have, squinting through the dark. I couldn't tell if I was looking at an actual person or something else. Eventually I drove off, but the sight stuck with me. If it was just a person, they had no business being in there at that time. If it wasn't, well, that thought doesn't sit right either. Working there for those months left me with more questions than answers. I never saw the excavator bang again, never saw the woman up close, but both moments linger. It's not like in movies where you get a clear ghost standing right in front of you. It's always something you could explain away if you try hard enough, but your gut tells you it's not that simple. And that's the thing about graveyards. You can mow the lawns, trim the trees, keep the stones clean, but you'll never shake the feeling that you're not the only one out there. Sometimes the dead remind you they've got company. Story 6. There's a strange heaviness you sometimes feel when you walk into certain places, like the air itself knows something you don't. That's how it was near Summit Creek, not far from Barkerville. The area looks ordinary at first glance, but if you stay there long enough, the silence starts pressing down, like a weight on your chest. I was out digging along the creek bed, searching the old ground the way prospectors used to, hoping for nothing more than bedrock and dirt. That stretch of creek had these neat piles of rocks stacked on either side. I didn't think much of it. Out there, you see plenty of odd rock formations left by miners 100 years back. I picked a spot and started working, my shovel scraping down until it hit something solid. At first I thought it was just another boulder, but the way the rocks seemed layered, placed intentionally, made me pause. They weren't scattered like debris. They were arranged. When I pried deeper, my shovel cut through something soft, and I swear to God my stomach turned over. It wasn't dirt, it wasn't wood either. The soil beneath had a strange color, and when I looked closer, it hit me. I'd disturbed one of those mounds, Chinese burials from the gold rush days. It wasn't just mining history I'd stumbled into. It was someone's grave. I pulled back instantly, heart hammering. I didn't want to see more, didn't want to find bones staring back at me. I covered it as best I could, stacking the rocks back with shaking hands, but the moment I did, everything felt wrong. The whole area around me seemed to change. I could feel eyes on me from every direction. Though the woods were empty, it wasn't the normal feeling of being alone in the bush. This was sharper, colder. That night I camped not far from the creek. The spot was quiet, too quiet. No crickets, no night birds. The wind would move the trees, but it sounded too controlled, almost like whispers carrying across the water. When I tried to sleep, every time I closed my eyes, I imagined figures standing just outside the firelight, staring at me without saying a word. I told myself it was just my nerves, but I couldn't shake it. By morning, the mist had rolled in. The whole creek was swallowed up in it, thick and clinging. You could only see a few feet ahead. As I packed up my gear, I kept catching glimpses, shapes shifting in the fog. It wasn't clear enough to call it people, but not vague enough to dismiss as tricks of the light. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. They'd linger just long enough for me to look, then melt away when I focused. The strangest part was the sound. Every so often, I heard what almost resembled the low murmur of voices, like a group talking far away. Not loud, not distinct, just a steady hum of conversation I couldn't quite make out. When I stopped moving, the sound stopped too. When I started again, it picked back up. It was like walking through a crowd I couldn't see. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, before the fog thinned enough for me to finally see the trail again. I didn't waste time. I left the creek behind without looking back. To this day, that spot feels wrong to me. I've passed near it a couple of times since, but I never go back to the mounds. Locals sometimes mention the same thing, that there's an unsettled feeling around Summit Creek, like you're being judged for even stepping too close. Maybe it's just the weight of history. Maybe it's guilt, knowing I disturbed something sacred that should have been left alone. Or maybe it's exactly what it felt like, that I wasn't alone out there, and the ones buried along that creek were making sure I never forgot it. Story 7. Cemeteries are strange places after dark. During the day, they're quiet in a sad sort of way, filled with flowers, whispers, and people visiting loved ones. But once the sun goes down, all that quietness turns heavy, like the air itself doesn't want you there anymore. I used to work in sales for a cemetery, and part of that job wasn't just talking with families. It was also about making sure the place was locked up properly at night, the mausoleum especially. I'd have to walk through, check that no families were still inside, and secure the doors. Normally, it wasn't a big deal. At first, I thought of it like closing up a shop, but over time, I learned there's a very different feeling when the thing you're locking up is a building full of the dead. One night, everything felt off before I even stepped inside. The weather was still, no wind, no movement, but I couldn't shake the sensation that the air in front of the mausoleum was somehow thicker. I brushed it off and went about my usual routine. The lights inside were dim, and shadows stretched long down the hallway, making the marble walls look endless. I remember my footsteps echoing louder than usual, bouncing back at me as if someone else were walking just a half second behind. My nerves prickled, but I kept going. I was halfway through the hallway when it happened. The sound came from behind me, quick, sharp, and gone almost instantly. A scratching noise, faint but clear enough to stop me dead in my tracks. It didn't sound like something falling or a door creaking. It was something more deliberate, like nails dragging across stone. The first thought that shot through my mind was something I never wanted to imagine in that place, that it sounded like someone clawing their way out from the other side of one of those crypts. My whole body went cold in an instant. I wanted to turn around, but every part of me screamed not to. It felt like if I looked back, I'd actually see something I wouldn't be able to explain. Instead, I just stood there, frozen, my heart hammering against my chest so hard it almost drowned out the silence that followed. The air felt heavier, pressing in on me, and the longer I stood there, the more I realized I had two choices. keep checking the rooms behind me like I was supposed to, or get out. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a rat, maybe a bird had gotten in, maybe even the building settling. But none of those things explained why it sounded exactly like fingernails scraping across marble. I forced myself to move again, this time faster, and I kept my eyes fixed forward. I couldn't bring myself to glance back, not even once. When I finally reached the doors and locked them, I walked out of there like nothing had happened, but my legs were shaking. Outside, the night air felt cooler, almost like stepping into safety. Still, I didn't stop until I reached my car, and even then, I sat there for a while, trying to catch my breath before driving away. For days afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every little sound in my house made me jump. The scratching replayed over and over in my head, and the idea that maybe I had heard something I wasn't supposed to lingered with me. 3 nights later, I had to lock up again. I was dreading it the whole day, stomach in knots. But when I finally went back in, the place was quiet, not a sound. I walked through quickly, checked everything, and left without any more incidents. Nothing like that ever happened again. Still, even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that single sound. Perhaps it was just a rodent trapped somewhere, or maybe I let my imagination run wild due to my surroundings. But the truth is, deep down, it didn't feel like that. It felt too sharp, too real, too much like something that wasn't supposed to be heard by the living. I'll never know what it was for sure, but I do know one thing. I'll never forget that scratching noise behind me in the mausoleum. Story 8. I've always had this odd hobby that most people don't really understand. Whenever I get free time, I end up in cemeteries, not for anything morbid, but because I do genealogy research. I photograph headstones, map out the grounds, and record details that might help people trace family histories later. It's peaceful work, quiet, and usually uneventful. But one night I stayed out later than I should have, and I ended up regretting that decision in ways I'll never forget. The cemetery itself wasn't anything fancy. It was an old country one, tucked in the middle of endless cornfields. No houses nearby, no street lamps, just dirt roads cutting through farmland. I'd driven out with my gear and figured I could finish up before dark, but as it happens with me, I lost track of time. By the time I looked up, the sun had dropped, and the whole place had turned that strange gray-blue color you only see right before full darkness sets in. I told myself I'd be fine. I'd just wrap up a few more rows and head back to the car. That's when I noticed them. At first, it looked like fireflies sparking across the cemetery. That wouldn't have been unusual. Summer nights in farm country are full of them. But when I paid closer attention, I realized these lights weren't behaving like bugs. They weren't flickering on and off randomly, and they weren't darting around. They were too big, too steady, and seemed to hover in place or drift very slowly between the stones. My stomach knotted, but I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was a reflection from a house light way out in the distance, or headlights bouncing off something. But I knew deep down there weren't any houses or cars out here. I kept my head down and focused on packing up, but my eyes wouldn't stop darting back to the strange glow. Each time I looked, there seemed to be more of them. Little clusters of steady orbs, just hanging there, like they were watching. The longer I stood there, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. That's when the fear really started to crawl in. The thought hit me that maybe it wasn't something paranormal, but something worse. What if it were a person out there with a flashlight, or multiple people? This place was isolated. No one would hear me if something happened. I gripped my tripod like a weapon and tried to scan the darkness, but my nerves got the best of me. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear the blood in my ears. As I started walking toward the car, I realized how far I'd wandered from it. Every shadow between the gravestones seemed to lean toward me, stretching as if something was moving behind them. The lights didn't go away either. They followed, or maybe it just felt like they did. Every time I looked over my shoulder, they seemed closer, shifting slowly like they were gliding right above the ground. By the time I could see my car, panic had taken over completely. My gear clattered in my hands and I could barely keep hold of everything. My legs felt heavy, like I was dragging myself through mud, but I forced myself not to stop. I didn't dare look around anymore. If I saw something worse than those lights, I knew I'd freeze. So I kept my eyes locked on the car, repeating in my head that I just had to get inside and lock the doors. I slammed everything in the back seat without even caring if it broke. As I shut the driver's door and started the ignition, I made the mistake of glancing out the windshield one more time. In the distance, right where I'd been working, I saw the orbs again. Dozens of them now, scattered across the cemetery like candles laid out on every grave. I sped off down the dirt road without looking back. Even now, I can't explain it. Maybe it really was some weird phenomenon, swamp gas, or something bouncing off the cornfields. Maybe my eyes were just playing tricks in the dark. But the memory of those steady, silent lights following me will never leave. And the worst part is the feeling that if I had lingered even a few minutes longer, I might have found out what they really were. Story 9. Graveyards at night always carried this strange stillness, like the world had paused just outside the gates. When I first started working maintenance there, I thought it would be peaceful, cutting grass, cleaning headstones, picking up flowers when the wind scattered them. It seemed like one of those quiet jobs where you could just exist in your own head. For the most part, it was exactly that. But every once in a while, something would happen that didn't fit the normal rhythm of life and death. Something that made the silence feel heavier. I was about 6 months in when things started to feel off. The first time, it wasn't even anything big. I had been trimming along the fence line late in the day when I heard this sharp noise, like a stick snapping. I figured it was a raccoon or a stray cat, so I ignored it. But when I turned back to my work, there were fresh flowers laid across a grave I had just cleaned. No one had been there when I'd passed through moments before. I told myself I must have overlooked them, even though I was sure I hadn't. Still, I brushed it off and kept moving. The next weird thing happened about 2 weeks later. I was making rounds at dusk, checking for vandalism since a few kids had been sneaking in at night. The cemetery was empty, but I swear I heard a low whistle travel across the stones. It was faint, almost like wind moving through the trees, but steadier, like an actual tune. It stopped the moment I raised my flashlight. I waited, listening, but nothing followed. No footsteps, no talking, just the kind of silence where your own breathing sounds too loud. Again, I pushed it aside, told myself it was just the air slipping through the branches. But then came the night that really stuck with me. It was late September, cool enough that my breath fogged the air as I walked. The sky had no moon, just a few scattered stars trying to break through the clouds. I had the flashlight with me, its beam cutting across the stones like a knife. Everything looked sharper in that light. The names carved into granite, the angels standing watch, even the dead flowers clinging to old vases. I was halfway across one of the newer rows when my light caught on something that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was a pile of leaves or maybe an animal nest that had blown across the grounds. But as I got closer, the shape came into focus. Sitting dead center on the smooth stone was the head of a rabbit. Just the head. No body, no blood, no entrails. It was intact, almost too intact, like it hadn't been ripped from anything but placed there. Its fur was still neat, ears standing upright, glassy eyes fixed open. It looked less like roadkill and more like someone had taken a knife, made a perfect cut, and carefully set it there. The rest of the grave was spotless. No marks in the dirt, no feathers or fur scattered nearby, no signs of a predator's mess. I froze, my stomach twisting. My first thought was that maybe a hawk had dropped it, but I'd seen hawk kills before, and they weren't this clean. They were brutal, messy, feathers and guts everywhere. This was different, precise, almost intentional. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at it while my flashlight made the shadows around me twitch. I kept waiting for something to move, for someone to step out from behind a stone and admit it was a prank. But nothing came. Just that rabbit head staring blankly up at the sky. I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Instead, I logged it in the maintenance book and left it for the morning crew. Still, all through the night, my mind kept going back to it. The way it sat perfectly centered, the way there was no mess, the way it almost felt like it had been left as a message. After that night, I began to notice more small things. A stone vase overturned, even though the flowers inside stayed neatly arranged. A single candle burned down to a stub, sitting on a grave I knew hadn't had one earlier in the day. On another evening, I thought I heard the crunch of footsteps behind me, but when I spun around, My light only showed empty grass and rows of markers. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild after the rabbit incident, but deep down I wasn't convinced.